Tonight we stand on a hillside in medieval England, the grass damp beneath your worn leather boots as a cold mist rolls up from the valley below. You pull your wool cloak tighter around your shoulders and listen to the soft bleating of sheep somewhere in the fog, their bells clanking gently with each step they take through the gloom. The wind carries the smell of wet earth and something like wood smoke from a distant fire, though you know the nearest village lies at least 3 hours' walk from here, down treacherous paths you wouldn't dare attempt in this light. You are alone. Completely, utterly alone, with nothing but 100 woolly bodies and the vast empty sky for company. And you will remain here for months on end without seeing another human face. Your fingers curl around the walking staff in your hand, its surface smooth from years of use, and you realize that this simple piece of wood has become more than just a tool. It has become your confidant, your canvas, your legacy. But before we get too comfortable with this lonely scene, let's be honest. You probably won't survive this life. Shepherds in the Middle Ages dropped dead from exposure, were gored by irate rams, tumbled into ravines during spring storms, or simply vanished into the mist one day and were never seen again. The job came with about as much job security as being a medieval plague doctor, and roughly the same life expectancy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the weight of the staff before you feel anything else about this life. It's not just in your hand, it's become an extension of your arm, something you reach for without thinking when you stand up from your damp bed of straw and heather each morning. The sheep know it too. They watch you with those strange, sideways eyes as you walk among them, and they understand that the stick means authority, means direction, means the difference between staying safe on the grassy ridge and wandering into the bog where the mist plays tricks on old ewes. But this staff you hold isn't like the others you've seen. Where the shepherds from the next valley carry plain, functional sticks worn smooth by use, yours tells a story. Your thumb finds a groove carved years ago, a spiral that winds up the shaft like the path you take each morning from the bothy to the high pastures. Higher up, your fingers trace the shape of a sheep, crude but recognizable, a ewe you remember from your first season up here, the one who taught you that sheep are not stupid, just stubborn, and that stubbornness looks a lot like wisdom when you've survived 30 winters on these hills. The mist shifts and for a moment you see the bothy, your home for these long months. It's a rough stone structure with a turf roof, barely tall enough to stand in, with a fire pit in the center and smoke finding its way out through a hole that also lets in rain and snow and the occasional curious bird. Inside, propped against the wall, you know there are other staffs. Staffs you finished over the years, staffs you're working on now, staffs you started and abandoned when the pattern refused to come right or when winter arrived early and your fingers were too cold to hold the knife. Each one holds a piece of you, a record of the day spent up here with nothing but your thoughts and the woolly company. Historians still argue whether shepherds carved these intricate walking sticks purely to pass the time, or whether something deeper drove them. A need to create meaning in a life that offered little of it, to leave a mark on something that would outlast their own brief, cold existence on the hills. You sit on a rock that's been worn smooth by generations of shepherds before you, their backsides polishing the stone just as surely as your knife polishes the wood. The fog continues to roll, muffling sound until the only things you hear are your own breathing and the occasional clank of a sheep bell somewhere in the white. You pull out your knife, a simple blade of good steel, sharp enough to shave with, given to you by your father who got it from his father before him, and you look at the staff across your knees. It's a new one, cut from a hazel thicket down in the valley last spring, still green when you started but now seasoned by months in the bothy, ready to receive whatever marks you choose to give it. And that's the question, isn't it? What will you carve? What story will this piece of wood tell when it's finished, when it stands in the corner of some cottage down in the village, long after you've gone back to the earth that bore you? The sheep have settled now, their bells growing quieter as they tuck themselves into the hollows and wait out the fog. You have hours yet before the light fails entirely, hours of sitting here with your knife and your thoughts and the vast empty silence. Your hand moves almost of its own accord, the blade finding purchase in the wood, and you watch as a curl of pale shaving lifts away, revealing fresh grain beneath. It's the first cut of many, the beginning of something you can't yet see, and as you make it you feel something shift inside you. A settling, a focus, a sense that this is what the solitude has been preparing you for all along. You wake before dawn, which isn't difficult when dawn means the faintest lightening of the sky somewhere beyond the bothy's single tiny window, and when your bed consists of heather and straw laid directly on cold earth. Your back protests as you sit up. It always does, and you've learned to ignore it the way you ignore the constant damp and the way your breath forms small clouds in the air inside your own shelter. The fire died hours ago, and you have maybe 15 minutes of warmth stored in your bones before the cold seeps back in. So you move quickly, pulling on your cloak and boots, stepping out into the grey half-light to check on the flock before you do anything else. The sheep are where they should be, more or less. A small group has drifted toward the ravine, and you'll need to move them back before full light. But for now they're safe, and you count them as you always do, not by numbers, because numbers require keeping track and remembering, but by faces. You know each sheep individually, know which ones are prone to wandering and which ones will lead the flock back to the bothy if a storm blows in. Know the ones who limp slightly from old injuries and the ones who will fight you over a choice patch of grass. This knowledge didn't come quickly. It came from months of watching, of sitting on this hillside day after day until the sheep stopped seeing you as a threat and started accepting you as simply part of the landscape, a strange upright creature that moved among them without causing harm. Back inside the bothy, you coax the fire back to life with yesterday's embers and a handful of dry kindling you'd stashed beneath your sleeping platform. The smoke finds its way out through the roof hole eventually, but not before filling the small space with enough haze to make your eyes water. You've stopped noticing most days. Breakfast is oatmeal cooked in water, with a small lump of cheese if you're feeling rich and a dribble of honey if you manage to trade for some at the last market. You eat it standing by the fire, your staff propped beside you, and you listen to the sounds of morning. Sheep bells starting to move, birds calling from the scrub, the distant trickle of a stream somewhere down the slope. These sounds have become your music, your only company beside your own thoughts, and you've learned to hear them the way a musician hears an orchestra, picking out individual notes from the whole. The routine of a shepherd's day is endless repetition. You walk the flock to fresh grazing, counting them again as they move, watching for any signs of distress or illness. You check the boundaries of your territory, making sure no sheep have strayed into the next valley where the other shepherd's flock grazes. A situation that can lead to arguments, sometimes violence, if the wrong animal is claimed by the wrong man. You look for predators, though wolves have grown scarce in these parts, driven out by generations of hunters and shepherds who saw them as the only enemy worth fighting. You mend fences when there are fences, which is rarely, because most of your boundaries are natural, ravines, streams, ridges too steep for sheep to navigate safely. You sit. You watch. You wait. And in the waiting, your hands find work. The staff you started yesterday lies across your knees as you settle onto your watching rock, the flock spread out before you in a woolly carpet that shifts and ripples as the animals graze. Your knife is in your hand before you've consciously decided to pick it up, and you find yourself studying the wood, looking for something you can't quite name. The hazel is pale beneath its bark, the grain tight and even, and you remember cutting it last spring when the sap was rising and the wood was flexible enough to bend without breaking. You'd wrapped it and stored it in the bothy's rafters, letting it season slowly through summer and autumn, and now it's ready, hard enough to hold a carved shape, soft enough to accept your knife without fighting you. Historians still argue whether shepherds like you carved these intricate staffs primarily to pass the time, or whether the carving itself served some deeper psychological need. But sitting here on this damp hillside, with nothing but sheep and wind and the slow crawl of clouds across the sky, you understand something the historians don't. Time doesn't pass when you're this alone. It accumulates. It piles up around you like snow in a winter storm, burying you in moments that feel exactly like every other moment, until the days blur together and you lose track of whether this is Tuesday or Thursday, June or July. Your hands need to do something, not because you're bored in the modern sense of the word, but because without the movement of your fingers, without the small decisions involved in guiding a blade through wood, you might simply stop moving altogether. You might become as still as the rocks around you, as silent as the mist that rolls through the valley. The first cut of the day is always the hardest. It commits you to something, to a direction and a purpose, and once you've started removing wood you can't put it back. Today you decide to work on the spiral that began near the base, extending it another turn around the shaft. Your knife moves in long, controlled strokes, each one lifting a thin curl of wood that falls away into your lap, and you watch the pattern emerge as if it were always there, waiting for you to uncover it. The sheep graze on, indifferent to your creation. A raven calls from somewhere above, and you look up to see it circling, riding the thermals that rise from the valley floor. You wonder what the world looks like from up there, all spread out like a map, with tiny sheep and tiny shepherds and tiny bothies sending tiny threads of smoke into the vast sky. The day wears on in its usual rhythm. You move the flock twice, following the grass as the sun tracks across the sky. You eat a midday meal of bread and more cheese, washing it down with water from the stream. You watch a pair of lambs chase each other in circles, their legs still unsteady, their bleating high and playful. And all the while, your knife continues its work, adding line after line to the staff until the spiral has grown by several turns and the wood beneath your fingers feels different somehow. More yours, more alive, more like a conversation you're having with the hazel tree that gave its life for this purpose. As evening approaches and you gather the flock back toward the bothy for the night, you run your thumb along the fresh carving and feel a small satisfaction. The day has passed, as days always do, but it hasn't passed emptily. You've made something. You've added yourself to the world in a small but permanent way. And tomorrow, if the weather holds and the sheep cooperate, you'll add a little more. The rain starts mid-morning and doesn't stop. You've seen this kind of rain before, the kind that falls straight down, heavy and relentless, turning the hillside into a bog and the sheep into miserable, dripping lumps who huddle together and refuse to move. There's no point trying to work in this. No point sitting on your rock, no point walking the flock to better grazing, no point doing anything except finding shelter and waiting it out. So you retreat to the bothy, pulling the door closed behind you, and you sit on your sleeping platform listening to the drumming on the turf roof and wondering how long this one will last. Hours pass. The rain continues. You've checked your supplies twice, rearranged your spare clothing, counted the remaining cheese, and stared at the fire until your eyes water. The sheep are fine. You checked them between downpours, found them huddled in a natural hollow where they'll stay until the weather breaks. There's nothing to do. Absolutely nothing. And this is when you understand something profound about the life you've chosen, or that chose you. Boredom isn't a minor inconvenience up here. It's a force of nature, as real and powerful as the rain itself, and it will eat you alive if you let it. You reach for the staff without thinking. Not the new one, that one's still in progress, still waiting for inspiration, but an older staff, one you finished years ago and kept because you couldn't bear to part with it. Your fingers trace the patterns as you've done 1,000 times before, each groove and notch familiar as your own face. There's the ewe who died lambing, her shape crude but recognizable near the base. There's the spiral that represents the path to the high summer pastures, the one you carved during a particularly lonely August when the only company was a pair of ravens who nested on the cliffs. There's the cross that marks the winter your mother died, when you stayed up here because the flock needed you and going down meant facing a grief you weren't ready to feel. The staff holds all of it. Every significant moment of your life on these hills, carved into wood because there was no one to tell, no one who would understand, no one who cared about the small dramas that made up your days. And sitting here in the bothy, with rain drowning the world outside, you realize that the carving isn't just something you do to pass the time. It's something you do to survive the time. To make the hours mean something when they otherwise wouldn't. To leave a record of your existence in a world that has forgotten you exist at all. Historians still argue whether medieval shepherds experienced what we would now call mental health challenges. Depression, anxiety, the crushing weight of isolation that modern psychology has names for. But you don't need a name for it. You know what it feels like to wake up and wonder if anyone would notice if you didn't wake up tomorrow. You know what it feels like to go weeks without speaking, to have your voice crack when you finally do talk to a passing traveler, to find yourself having conversations with sheep simply because they're the only living things that will listen. And you know what it feels like to pick up a knife and a piece of wood and slowly, painstakingly, carve yourself back into existence. The rain shows no signs of stopping. You reach for the new staff, the one with the spiral you started yesterday, and you examine it in the firelight. The spiral looks good, clean lines, even spacing, a rhythm that feels right under your fingers. But it's not enough. A spiral is just a shape, just decoration, just something to fill space. What you need now is meaning. What you need now is something that will hold the weight of this rainy day, this endless drumming on the roof, this feeling of being trapped in a small stone box with nothing but your thoughts for company. Your knife finds the wood near the top of the staff, above where the spiral ends, and you begin to cut. You don't know yet what you're making. You never do, not really. The designs come as you carve, emerging from the wood like memories emerging from fog, and you follow them where they lead. Today they lead to a shape that might be a bird, might be a leaf, might be something else entirely. It doesn't matter. What matters is the cutting, the shaving, the small decisions that accumulate into pattern. What matters is that your hands are busy and your mind follows them, leaving behind the weight of solitude and focusing instead on the simple challenge of making one line flow into another. The sheep bells are silent outside, muffled by rain. The fire pops and hisses, sending sparks up toward the smoke hole. Your knife moves steadily, and you lose yourself in the rhythm of it. The scrape of blade on wood, the curl of shavings falling into your lap, the slow revelation of form from formlessness. This is what the historians miss when they talk about boredom as a problem to be solved. Boredom isn't the enemy. Emptiness is the enemy. And carving fills the emptiness, fills it with something tangible and lasting, something that proves you were here, that you existed, that you spent your days doing more than just surviving. By evening, the rain has softened to a drizzle, and you've added a border of small notches around the bird shape, giving it texture and depth. You hold the staff up to the firelight and study your work. It's not finished, it's never finished, not really, because there's always more time to fill, more days to survive, more emptiness to push back against. But it's something. It's more than nothing. And as you set the staff aside and prepare for another night in the bothy, listening to the drip of water through the roof and the soft sounds of the flock settling outside, you feel a small warmth that has nothing to do with the fire. You've made it through another day. And tomorrow, if the rain returns, you'll make it through that one too. The branch lies across your knees, and you haven't cut anything yet. This is the moment that matters most, the moment before the first cut, when the wood is still pure potential, still capable of becoming anything. You found it 3 days ago, tucked into a hazel thicket down in the valley, growing straight and true with no knots or twists to mar its length. You cut it carefully, thanking the tree in the old way that your grandfather taught you, and you carried it back up the hill with a feeling you couldn't quite name. Now it's here, seasoned just enough by the bothy's dry air, and you're about to change it forever. Your knife is sharp. You checked it twice this morning, running your thumb along the edge until you felt the tiny bite of steel against skin. A dull knife is dangerous, more likely to slip and cut you than a sharp one, and up here a serious cut could mean infection, could mean fever, could mean death with no one to help you. So you keep it sharp, keep it clean, keep it ready for moments like this. The hazel wood is pale beneath its bark, the grain running straight and true, and as you grip it in your left hand you feel a connection to something older than yourself. People have been cutting wood on these hills for thousands of years, long before anyone thought to build bothies or keep sheep or carve patterns into walking sticks. You're part of that chain now, another link in a tradition that stretches back into the mist. The first cut is always the hardest. Not because of the physical effort. The knife is sharp, the wood is willing, and a single pass lifts a thin curl of bark and cambium without resistance. The difficulty lies in commitment. Once you've made this cut, you can't unmake it. The wood will never be smooth and untouched again. It will bear your mark forever, carry your intention forward into whatever future awaits it. Your hand trembles slightly, just for a moment, and then you press the blade in and draw it along the shaft, and the first curl of shaving lifts away, pale and delicate, falling onto your lap and then to the ground where the sheep will trample it into mud. You're starting simple. A spiral, like the one on your old staff, because spirals are forgiving, they hide mistakes, they flow naturally, they don't require the precision of faces or animals or the complex interlace patterns you've seen on staffs from other valleys. The knife moves in a long, steady arc, following the natural grain of the wood, and you watch as a shallow groove appears in the hazel surface. It's barely visible, just a slight indentation, but it's yours. You made it. You exist, and now this wood exists differently because of you. The morning passes in this rhythm. Cut, examine, adjust, cut again. The spiral grows slowly, each turn of the blade extending the pattern another few inches up the shaft. You work by feel as much as sight, your fingers reading the wood surface for variations in density, for places where the grain might cause the knife to catch or skip. The sheep graze around you, indifferent to your concentration, and the sun climbs toward its zenith, burning off the last of yesterday's damp. A lark sings somewhere above, its song falling like water through the clear air, and you find yourself humming along without realizing you're doing it. By midday, you've completed perhaps a third of the spiral. You stop to eat, bread and cheese again, washed down with water from the stream, and you study your work while you chew. It's good. Not perfect, but good. The lines are even, the spacing consistent, the depth uniform enough that the pattern catches the light and throws shadows that shift as you turn the staff. You think about the shepherd who will eventually own this staff, assuming you finish it and trade it or give it away. Will they notice the care you've taken? Will they run their fingers along these grooves and feel the hours you've invested, the solitude you've transformed into something beautiful? Or will they simply see a stick, useful for walking, useful for guiding sheep, useful for leaning on when the hills grow steep? Historians still argue whether shepherds carved these staffs primarily for themselves or for others, whether the intricate patterns represented personal expression or commercial value. But sitting here on this hillside, with the sun warm on your face and the smell of sheep and grass filling the air, you understand that the question misses the point. You're carving for both reasons and neither. You're carving because your hands need something to do. You're carving because the wood asks it of you. You're carving because in this vast empty landscape, making something is the only way to feel like you're still human, still connected to the world of intention and creation that exists somewhere beyond these hills. The afternoon passes more quickly than the morning. Your rhythm settles into something almost meditative, the knife moving in long strokes, the shavings accumulating around your feet until you're sitting in a small drift of pale curls that smell faintly of hazel. The spiral grows, winding its way up the shaft, and you find yourself adding small variations. A slightly deeper cut here, a slightly wider spacing there, that make it uniquely yours. No other shepherd will ever create exactly this pattern, exactly this rhythm of groove and ridge. In a world where most things are shared and communal and indistinguishable from each other, this staff will be singular. As evening approaches and you gather the flock for the night, you hold the staff differently. It's not finished. It won't be finished for weeks, maybe months, depending on how much time you have and how detailed you want to get. But it's begun. It's real. And as you walk among the sheep, counting them by the familiar shapes of their faces, You feel a small warmth in your chest that has nothing to do with the fading sun. You made something today. Tomorrow you'll make a little more. And eventually, if you live long enough and the weather holds and the sheep cooperate, you'll have made something that will outlast you entirely. The night is clear and cold, and you can't sleep. This happens sometimes. The silence grows too heavy, the darkness too complete, and your mind refuses to settle no matter how tired your body feels. You lie on your heather bed, listening to the sheep bells outside and the small sounds of the bothy settling around you, and you think about things you'd rather not think about. You think about the family you left behind in the village, the way your mother's hands looked the last time you saw them, gnarled with age and arthritis, still trying to mend a torn shirt because that's what mothers do. You think about the girl you might have married if the flock hadn't needed you, if your father hadn't died young and left you responsible for animals that don't care about your feelings. You think about God, or the lack of God, or the vast empty spaces between what the priests say and what you actually experience up here on the hill. The thoughts won't stop. They circle like wolves, each one leading to another, and you know from experience that trying to push them away only makes them stronger. So instead you sit up, reach for the staff you've been working on, and strike a spark to the lantern that hangs from the bothy's central post. The flame catches, small and orange, throwing just enough light to work by. Your knife is where it always is, tucked into your belt even while you sleep, and you draw it out and settle the staff across your knees and begin to carve. You don't plan what you're going to make. Planning would require thinking, and thinking is the problem. Thinking is what keeps you awake, what fills your chest with an ache you can't name, what makes the bothy feel smaller and darker and more isolated than it ever does during the day. So you let your hands move without direction, let the blade find its own path through the wood, and you watch as shapes emerge that you didn't consciously intend. The first shape is a cross. Small, simple, carved near the top of the staff where your hand rests naturally when you're walking. You don't consider yourself particularly religious. The priests are distant figures who visit the valley once or twice a year, collect their tithes, and disappear again. But the cross appears anyway, a prayer you didn't know you were praying. You think of your mother again, of the way she crossed herself each morning and each night, of the small wooden cross she kept above the door and touched whenever she left the cottage. You wonder if she's touching it now, if she's thinking of you up here on the hill, if she's praying for your safety in a world where safety is never guaranteed. The knife keeps moving. Below the cross, you find yourself carving a shape that might be a hand, might be a leaf, might be something else entirely. It becomes a hand as you work on it, the fingers suggested by a few careful cuts, the palms smoothed and rounded. A hand reaching upward, toward the cross, toward something beyond itself. You don't know whose hand it is, yours, your mother's, God's, but it feels important, feels like something you needed to say even if you don't have words for it. Historians still argue whether medieval shepherds were deeply religious or largely indifferent, whether the carved patterns on their staffs carried spiritual meaning or were simply decorative. But sitting here in the lantern light, with the night pressing against the bothy's thin walls, you understand that the question is too simple. Faith isn't something you have or don't have. It's something that shifts and changes, that grows stronger in some moments and weaker in others, that exists alongside doubt and fear and the long cold hours of darkness. Your carving isn't a statement of belief. It's a reaching, a groping towards something you can't quite grasp, a way of shaping hope when hope feels foolish and remote. The hand grows more detailed as you work. You add lines suggesting fingers, a hint of a wrist, a slight curve that makes it look like it's moving, like it's actually reaching rather than just frozen in position. The cross above it catches the lantern light, throwing a small shadow across the wood, and you realize you've created a kind of conversation between the two shapes. The hand reaching up, the cross reaching down, meeting somewhere in the middle of the staff where your own hand rests as you carve. Outside, a sheep bleats softly, then settles again. The wind picks up slightly, rustling the turf on the roof, and you hear the small sounds of mice moving in the walls. The bothy feels less empty now, less oppressive. The carving has done what carving always does. It has filled the space, pushed back against the darkness, given you something to hold on to when your thoughts threaten to sweep you away. You work for another hour, maybe two. Time loses meaning in the lantern light, measured only by the slow progress of the blade and the gradual accumulation of shavings on your lap and the floor. Below the hand, you add a series of small marks that might represent the flock, might represent your family, might represent nothing at all. It doesn't matter. What matters is the rhythm of cutting, the small decisions that accumulate into pattern, the feeling of creation that pushes back against the void. When you finally set the staff aside and blow out the lantern, the darkness feels different. It's still dark, still complete, still pressing against the bothy from all sides. But you've left something in it now, something that wasn't there before. You've carved your prayers into wood, given them form and permanence, made them real in a way that thoughts alone can never be. And as you settle back onto your heather bed and feel sleep finally beginning to creep in, you understand that this is why shepherds carve, not just to pass the time, but to make the invisible visible, to give shape to the shapeless, to hold on to faith when faith feels like nothing but air. The ewe is dying, and there's nothing you can do about it. You've known this was coming for days. She's old, older than any sheep has a right to be in these hills, and she's been slowing down all summer, lagging behind the flock, sleeping more and eating less. Now she lies on her side in a hollow, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes fixed on something you can't see. You sit beside her, your hand on her wool, and you wait because waiting is all that's left. The flock grazes nearby, indifferent to her passing, and the sky stretches vast and empty above you, and you feel the weight of all the deaths you've witnessed in your years on this hill. She goes quietly, without struggle. Just a final breath and then nothing. You sit with her for a while longer, your hand still on her wool, and you think about the years you've spent together. She was one of the first sheep you inherited when your father died, a young ewe then, skittish and wild, and you'd spent months earning her trust. She'd followed you through blizzards, led the flock when the path was uncertain, taught generations of lambs how to navigate these treacherous slopes. Now she's gone, and the hill feels emptier for her absence. You don't bury her. There's no point. The ground is too rocky, too hard, and besides, the ravens and foxes will take what they need and the bones will bleach in the sun and eventually scatter, becoming part of the hill just as she was part of it in life. But before you leave her, you reach for your knife and you cut a small lock of her wool, the softest part from behind her ears, and you tuck it into your pouch. Then you stand, gather the flock, and guide them away from the hollow where their sister lies, because sheep are practical creatures and they'll keep grazing right past her body if you let them, and you can't bear to watch that today. That evening, back in the bothy, you take out the staff you've been working on and you study it in the firelight. The spiral is complete now, winding from near the base to just below where your hand rests. The cross and the hand are there too, carved into the wood above the spiral, reaching toward each other across the shaft. But there's space left, there's always space left, and tonight you know what belongs there. Your knife finds the wood just above the spiral's end, and you begin to carve a ewe. Not just any ewe, but this ewe, the one who died today, the one who trusted you and followed you and taught you more than any human ever could. You carve her shape carefully, the curve of her back, the tilt of her head, the way her ears always seemed to be listening even when there was nothing to hear. It's crude work, you're no artist, just a shepherd with a knife, but as the shape emerges from the wood, you feel something shift inside you. She's not gone. She's here, in your hands, in the staff, in the wood that will outlast you both. The carving takes hours. You work by firelight, stopping occasionally to warm your hands or add more fuel to the flames, but mostly just working, cutting, shaping, remembering. You carve the way she'd stand apart from the flock when she was thinking, the way she'd nudge her lambs towards safety, the way she'd look at you with those strange sideways eyes as if she understood more than she let on. Each detail costs you something, a small piece of attention, a small piece of memory, a small piece of the grief you've been carrying since you left her in that hollow. Historians still argue whether the animals carved on shepherd staffs represented individual creatures or generic symbols, whether a carved sheep was meant to memorialize a specific animal or simply to represent the flock as a whole. But sitting here in the firelight, with your knife moving through wood and your eyes wet with tears you're too tired to wipe away, you know the answer. This ewe is this ewe. No other sheep ever stood exactly like this, looked at you exactly like this, lived and died exactly like this. And now she'll live forever in the staff, in the pattern you've carved, in the memory you've made tangible. Below the ewe, you add a small lamb, one of her last, born in a spring snowstorm when you'd thought both of them would die, but she'd somehow found shelter in a cave and kept the lamb warm with her own body until you could reach them. That lamb is grown now, part of the flock, and you wonder if she remembers her mother, if sheep have memory the way humans do, if she'll notice the absence or just accept it as the way of things. The fire crackles and pops, sending sparks toward the smoke hole. Outside, the flock settles for the night, their bells clanking softly as they shift and dream. You work on, adding texture to the ewe's wool, depth to her eyes, a slight curve to her mouth that might be contentment or might just be the way the wood grain runs. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she's here, that you've brought her back from the hollow, that she'll walk with you through the hills for as long as this staff lasts. When you finally stop, your hands are cramped and your eyes are tired and the fire has burned down to embers. You set the staff aside, but you keep it close, within reach, where you can touch it if you need to. The ewe is there, carved into the wood, watching you with eyes that will never close. And as you drift towards sleep, you hear her voice in your memory, the soft bleat she made when she saw you coming, the sound that meant you were home, you were safe, you were where you belonged. You've been up here for 3 months now, and you haven't seen another human face in all that time. The isolation does things to you. Strange things, subtle things, things you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying attention. Your voice has grown rusty from disuse, cracking when you try to speak aloud to the sheep. Your dreams have become more vivid, more real, sometimes more real than waking life. And the staff in your hands has become something more than wooden carving. It has become you, or a version of you, or the you that exists when there's no one else around to define who you're supposed to be. You notice it first when you reach for the staff without thinking. Not as a tool, not as something to lean on or guide the flock with, but as something to hold, something to touch, something that grounds you when the vast emptiness of the hills starts to feel like it's swallowing you whole. Your hand finds it automatically, the way a child might reach for a blanket or a toy, and your fingers trace the familiar patterns. The spiral, the cross, the hand, the U, and you feel yourself settle, feel yourself become solid again, feel yourself remember who you are. Who are you, exactly? It's a harder question than it used to be. Down in the village, you were someone's son, someone's neighbor, someone's customer at the market. You had a name, a family, a place in the web of relationships that defined medieval life. Up here, you're just the shepherd. The sheep know you, but they don't know your name. The hills know you, but they don't care who you are. The wind knows you, but it treats you the same as it treats the rocks and the grass and the scattered bones of animals who died before you were born. You could disappear tomorrow and nothing would change. The flock would scatter or be gathered by the next shepherd, the bothy would slowly decay, and in a few years no one would remember that you ever existed. But the staff remembers. The staff holds your story in its grain, your hours and days and months of solitude transformed into pattern. When you look at it, you see yourself reflected. Not your face, not your body, but something deeper. You see the spiral that represents the path you walk each day, the path that has worn itself into your muscles and your memory until you could walk it in your sleep. You see the you who died, the one who taught you patience and trust and the strange intimacy that can exist between a human and an animal. You see the cross and the hand, your prayers and your reaching, the parts of you that have no other outlet in this empty place. Historians still argue whether these carved staffs served as a form of personal identification, whether a shepherd could be recognized by the patterns on his stick the way a nobleman might be recognized by his coat of arms. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered across museum collections and old paintings and the occasional archaeological find. But sitting here on this hillside, watching your flock graze and feeling the familiar weight of your staff in your hand, you understand the truth without needing evidence. This staff is yours in a way that nothing else could be. No one else carved these patterns. No one else lived these hours. No one else could claim this stick and have it feel true. You think about the other shepherds you've met, the rare times when your paths cross at market or when one of you ventures into another's territory by accident. You remember their staffs, the patterns they carried, the stories written in their wood. There was the old man from the next valley whose staff was covered in spirals so dense and complex they seemed to move when you looked at them, each one representing a year of his life on the hills. There was the young woman who just started her first season alone, her staff still mostly bare except for a single flower carved near the top. A hopeful sign, you'd thought, a sign that she saw beauty in this harsh existence. There was the shepherd whose staff you'd found abandoned on a hillside, its carvings telling a story you could partly read. A long life, many flocks, many winters, but whose ending you never learned, because you never found the body and never learned his name. Your staff is becoming that kind of document, that kind of record. Each carving adds another chapter, another piece of the story that is your life on these hills. And as you add to it, you find yourself thinking about the future, not your future, because you try not to think about that too much, but the staff's future. What will happen to it when you're gone? Will it end up propped in a corner somewhere, slowly gathering dust until someone throws it on the fire? Will it pass to another shepherd, who might add their own carvings to yours, creating a layered history of two lives lived in the same place? Will it find its way to a museum centuries from now, where people who can't imagine this life will run their fingers over your patterns and wonder who you were? The questions have no answers, and you don't really need answers anyway. What matters is the carving itself, the daily act of adding yourself to the wood, the slow accumulation of pattern that proves you existed. Your hand moves to the staff now, finding a bare spot near the base, and your knife begins to cut. You're not sure yet what you're making. Maybe another sheep, maybe a representation of the bothy, maybe just a pattern that pleases your eye. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here, you're carving, you're leaving your mark. The staff is becoming you, and you are becoming the staff, and in the strange alchemy of solitude and creation, the two of you are learning to speak the same language. The day comes when you have to go down. It always does. Supplies run low, will need selling. Your family needs to see that you're still alive. You've been putting it off for weeks, telling yourself that the weather isn't right, that the flock needs you, that you'll go next week or the week after. But the truth is simpler and harder to admit. You're not sure you remember how to be around people anymore. The hills have changed you, reshaped you into something that fits their contours, and the thought of returning to the village, with its noise and its demands and its constant human presence, fills you with a dread you can't quite name. But you go anyway, because you have no choice. You pack your few possessions, leave the flock in the care of a neighboring shepherd who owes you a favor, and you start the long walk down. The staff comes with you, of course, it always comes with you, and as you descend from the hills, you find yourself holding it differently, gripping it more tightly, as if it might protect you from what's coming. The patterns catch the changing light as you move from open slopes to wooded valleys, and you run your thumb over them constantly, a nervous habit you've developed without noticing. The village appears below you, a scatter of cottages around a central green, smoke rising from chimneys, the distant sounds of dogs and children and livestock carrying up the slope. It looks smaller than you remember, and dirtier, and somehow less real than the hills you've left behind. You pause at the edge of the woods, not quite ready to step out into the open, and you look at your staff as if seeking permission or guidance. The yew stares back at you, carved and patient, And you remember that she trusted you even when the path was uncertain. You take a breath, grip the staff more firmly, and walk down into the village. Your mother is the first to see you. She's outside the cottage, drawing water from the well, and when she looks up and sees you approaching, her face goes through a series of changes you can't quite read. Surprise, relief, something that might be fear, something that might be love. She sets down the bucket and walks toward you, and you realize you don't know how to greet her. Do you embrace? Do you bow? Do you speak? Your voice catches in your throat, rusty from disuse, and all you can do is stand there holding your staff while she wraps her arms around you and holds on like you might disappear. The cottage feels strange after months in the bothy. It's warmer, more crowded, full of objects and smells and the constant presence of other people. Your siblings stare at you from corners, half-remembered faces that have grown and changed in your absence. Your father's chair is empty. He's been dead for years now, but you still expect to see him there, and your mother moves around you like you're something fragile, something that might break if handled roughly. You don't know what to do with your hands, so you hold the staff, and when they finally notice it, everything changes. "What's that?" your youngest sister asks, pointing. She's grown so much you barely recognize her, all gangly limbs and curious eyes. "What did you carve on it?" You try to explain, but the words won't come. How do you describe months of solitude, the death of a trusted you, the prayers carved in darkness, the slow accumulation of pattern that has become your identity? So instead you hold out the staff, let them take it, let them see for themselves. Your mother holds it first, her gnarled hands tracing the spiral, pausing at the cross, lingering on the U. She doesn't say anything, but her eyes are wet when she looks up at you, and you understand that she sees more than you could ever put into words. Your siblings gather around, reaching for the staff, their fingers exploring the patterns with a curiosity that feels almost like reverence. They ask questions. What's this? What's this? What's this? And you find your voice slowly, haltingly, explaining each carving in words that feel clumsy compared to the wood itself. The U was old, you tell them. The spiral is the path to the high pastures. The cross is for prayers, the hand is for reaching, the other shapes are for things you can't explain because you don't have the words. Historians still argue whether these carved staffs were primarily functional objects or something closer to art, whether the shepherds who made them thought of themselves as craftsmen or simply as men passing the time. But watching your family gather around your staff, their faces lit with wonder and something like pride, you understand that the categories don't matter. The staff is a gift, a piece of yourself brought down from the hills, a way of sharing a life they can barely imagine. It speaks when you cannot, tells stories you'd never know how to tell, reveals the person you've become in the solitude they'll never fully understand. That night, by the cottage fire, you watch as your mother holds the staff again, studying it in the flickering light. She runs her thumb over the U, over the spiral, over the cross, and you wonder what she's reading there. What story the wood tells her about the son she sent up the hill months ago and barely recognizes now. She doesn't ask you to explain further, doesn't press for details you can't provide. She just holds the staff, and holds it, and holds it, and when she finally sets it aside, she reaches out and takes your hand instead, and that's enough. Back on the hills, the carving continues. You've returned from the village with fresh supplies and a renewed sense of purpose, but also with something else. Awareness that the patterns on your staff aren't just personal decoration. They're language, a code, a way of communicating that transcends the spoken word. And you're not the only one who speaks it. It starts small. You're grazing the flock near the boundary of your territory when you spot another shepherd on the opposite slope, a figure barely visible in the distance. This happens sometimes, and usually you both just acknowledge each other with a wave and go back to your business. But today, the other shepherd raises his staff above his head, and you see something flash in the sunlight, a pattern, a shape, a signal. He's not just waving. He's speaking. You raise your own staff in response, hoping he can see the carvings, hoping he can read what you've written there. For a long moment, nothing happens. Then he lowers his staff and continues along his path, and you do the same, and the moment passes. But something has shifted. You've communicated, however briefly, in a language that has no words. The more you think about it, the more you realize how much of your carving is actually a form of speech. The spiral that winds up your staff, any shepherd who sees it will know it represents the path, the daily journey, the rhythm of the hills. The you carved, they'll recognize it as a memorial, a tribute, a record of loss. The cross and the hand, they'll understand those too, because shepherds are a religious lot, even the ones who don't go to church, even the ones who've spent so long alone that God feels like a distant memory. But there are other carvings, more personal ones, that only you can fully read. The small notch near the base that marks the winter you almost died, when the snow piled so high you couldn't leave the bothy for a week and you survived by burning your spare staffs one by one. The pattern of dots that represents your family, one for your mother, one for each sibling, one for the father who died too young. The strange, abstract shape that you carved during a fever dream, when the line between waking and sleeping dissolved and you saw things you still can't explain. These are yours alone, messages to yourself, reminders of a life that no one else can fully understand. Historians still argue whether the carvings on shepherd staffs constituted a formal symbolic system, a true language with agreed-upon meanings, or whether they were simply individual expressions that happened to share certain common motifs. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Medieval documents rarely mention the staffs, and when they do, it's in passing, as if the writers assumed everyone already knew what they meant. Archaeological finds are rare, and the wood rarely survives the centuries unless preserved in exceptional conditions. But sitting here on this hillside, watching another shepherd move along the distant ridge, you know that the language is real, even if no one has written it down. You think about the staff you saw at the market last year, the one covered in patterns so dense and intricate that you couldn't begin to read them all. The shepherd who carried it was old, older than anyone you'd ever met, and his hands were so gnarled with arthritis that you wondered how he could still hold a knife. But his staff told a story you could partially follow. The long spiral of a life spent on the hills, the many animals he'd lost and memorialized, the prayers carved in moments of desperation, the symbols that might represent children or grandchildren or the village he'd left behind decades ago. You wanted to ask him about it, to learn the meanings of the patterns you couldn't read, but the market was crowded and he disappeared before you could reach him. You've regretted that missed conversation ever since. Now, carving by firelight in the bothy, you add a new pattern to your staff, a series of interlocking curves that you've seen on other staffs but never fully understood. You're not sure what it means, exactly, but you know it means something. It's a greeting, maybe, or a blessing, or a way of saying I'm still here, I'm still carving, I'm still part of this strange community of solitary men. You carve it carefully, trying to match the versions you've seen, and as the pattern emerges, you feel yourself connected to something larger than your own small life. You're participating in a tradition, a conversation, a language that spans valleys and generations. The sheep graze on, indifferent to your linguistic experiments. The wind blows, the clouds move, the sun sets and rises and sets again. And you keep carving, keep adding to the staff, keep writing your life in wood. The language grows richer with each mark, each symbol, each carefully carved line. And somewhere on the opposite slope, another shepherd is doing the same thing, adding to his own staff, writing his own story in a language you're both still learning to read. The market fair arrives with the autumn, and you find yourself walking down from the hills with your flock in tow, your finest staff in your hand, and a strange mixture of anticipation and dread churning in your stomach. The fair is the biggest event of the year, a chance to sell wool and lambs, to buy supplies for the winter, to see faces you haven't seen in months. But it's also something else, something you've only recently come to understand. It's a competition. A silent, unspoken contest played out in wooden carvings, where shepherds measure themselves against each other without ever admitting that's what they're doing. You see it as soon as you enter the fairground. The shepherds cluster in their own corner, away from the farmers and traders and townsfolk, and they're all holding their staffs. Not leaning on them, not using them as tools, just holding them, displaying them, letting the carvings catch the light. You scan the crowd, reading staffs as you go, and you feel your confidence waver. There's one covered in spirals so fine and even they must have taken years to complete. Another depicts an entire flock, each sheep individually carved and recognizable. A third is wound through with a pattern so complex it seems to move when you look at it, optical illusions carved into wood. Your own staff feels suddenly inadequate. The spiral is good, you know that, clean lines, even spacing, a rhythm that feels right. The U is recognizable, maybe even touching if you're being generous. The cross and the hand have a certain rough sincerity. But compared to what you're seeing around you, it looks like the work of a beginner, someone still learning the language, still finding his way. You grip it tighter and try to look confident, but you're pretty sure you're failing. Then an old shepherd approaches you, and everything changes. He's ancient, older than anyone you've ever seen, with a face like weathered bark and hands that curve around his staff like roots around a stone. His staff is plain, almost completely uncarved, and for a moment you think you've misjudged him, that he's not one of the carvers at all. But then you look closer, and you see the faint lines, the subtle patterns worn nearly smooth by decades of handling. This staff has been carved and recarved, added to and modified, its story slowly erased by the very hands that created them. It's not plain. It's full. It's so full there's no room left for more. The old man looks at your staff, and you feel exposed, judged, found wanting. But then he nods, slowly, and reaches out a gnarled finger to trace the U you carved. His touch is light, almost reverent, and when he looks back at you, his eyes are wet. "She was a good one," he says. It's not a question. He knows. You nod, not trusting your voice. "I had one like her," he continues. 50 years ago. Maybe more. I still dream about her sometimes." He taps his own staff, the faint lines you can barely read. "She's in here. Somewhere. Worn away now, but I remember where she used to be." You stand together in silence, two shepherds from different generations, connected by the language carved into your staffs. Around you, the fair continues, buyers and sellers haggling, children running, animals bleating, but you barely notice. You're somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere the only sounds are the memory of sheep bells and the scrape of a knife on wood. Historians still argue whether these staffs were primarily functional, artistic, or symbolic, whether the competition among shepherds at fairs was a real phenomenon or just a romantic invention. But standing here with this old man, watching him trace the faint remnants of his own life's work, you know the truth. Of course there was competition. There's always competition among men who spend their lives alone, who have nothing to measure themselves against except each other. The staffs are proof of worth, evidence of patience, demonstrations of skill. When you show your staff at market, you're showing yourself, your dedication, your creativity, your ability to transform empty hours into something beautiful. But the old man's staff teaches you something else too. The competition doesn't last. The carvings wear away, the patterns fade, the stories slowly erase themselves no matter how deeply you cut. What remains, in the end, isn't the skill or the beauty or the intricacy. What remains is the simple fact that you carved, that you spent your life making something, that you left a mark however temporary. The old man's staff is almost blank now, but he still holds it, still treasures it, still remembers where the carvings used to be. And that's enough. You spend the rest of the day wandering the fair, staff in hand, watching the other shepherds and their creations. You see staffs that make you gasp with their beauty and staffs that make you wince with their awkwardness. You see patterns you recognize and patterns you've never imagined. You see a young shepherd, maybe 15 years old, clutching his first real staff, barely carved, just a few tentative marks, and you remember being that young, that uncertain, that hopeful. You catch his eye and nod, and he nods back, and for a moment you're connected across the gap of years and experience. By evening, you've sold your wool and bought your supplies, and you're ready to head back to the hills. But before you go, you find a quiet spot and take out your knife. The fair has shown you new possibilities, new patterns, new ways of speaking through wood. You find a bare spot on your staff, just below the hand, and you begin to carve. Something new, something you saw on an old man's staff, something that will connect you to the generations of shepherds who came before. The knife moves, the wood curls away, and you add yourself to the long conversation. The hazel thicket lies tucked into a sheltered valley, protected from the worst winds by a ridge of ancient stone. You've come here to find wood for a new staff. Your current one is nearly full, its surface covered with the accumulated patterns of years, and you need a fresh canvas for the winters ahead. But as you walk among the hazel stems, running your hands over their smooth bark, you realize that finding the right wood is more complicated than you'd thought. Each stem is different, each has its own character, its own story written in grain and growth rings and the subtle curves that record its struggle toward the light. You learned about wood from your father, who learned from his father before him. The lessons come back to you now as you examine each potential staff. Hazel is good, flexible, strong, takes carving well without splitting. But not all hazel is equal. The stems that grow in the open, exposed to wind and weather, develop tight grain and unexpected strength. The ones that grow in the shade, protected and sheltered, are softer, easier to carve but less durable. The ones that grow near water have a different character entirely. Their grain looser, their wood more prone to rot. You need to know not just what tree you're cutting, but where it grew, how it lived, what challenges shaped it into what it became. You find a stem that catches your eye, straight, tall, growing at the edge of the thicket where it's caught the full force of every storm. Its bark is rough, scarred in places where branches have broken, but the wood beneath feels dense and promising. You run your hand along its length, feeling for knots or twists, and you find almost none. This stem has grown true, has focused its energy on reaching upward rather than spreading outward. It will make a fine staff, if you cut it right. But cutting it right means more than just sawing through the base. Your father taught you that too. The tree must be thanked, must be honored, must be asked permission before you take its life. It sounds strange, maybe, to someone who's never lived alone on a hill with nothing but trees and sheep for company. But up here, where everything living is either food, tool, or companion, the lines between them blur. The tree has as much right to exist as you do. Taking its life requires acknowledgement, gratitude, a recognition that you're both part of something larger than yourselves. You kneel beside the hazel stem, place your hand on its bark, and speak the old words. They're not really words anymore, just sounds, almost a rhythm that your grandfather taught you and his grandfather taught him. But the meaning carries through the sounds. Thank you for your growth, thank you for your strength, thank you for the years you've spent reaching toward the sun. Your life will become part of my life, your wood will become my staff, your story will be carved into mine. It's a prayer, maybe, or a negotiation, or just a way of acknowledging that nothing exists in isolation. Then you cut. The blade bites into the base of the stem, and you work carefully, preserving as much length as possible, cutting at an angle that will help the tree heal rather than inviting rot. The stem falls with a soft rustle of leaves, and you catch it, hold it, feel the weight of it in your hands. It's heavier than you expected, denser, full of the life it's lived. You'll need to let it season for months before you can carve it properly. Let the moisture escape and the wood stabilize. But even now, fresh cut and raw, you can feel its potential, can almost see the patterns that will eventually emerge from its surface. Historians still argue whether medieval shepherds understood wood the way modern foresters do, whether they recognized different species properties, different growth conditions, different seasonal variations in quality. The written records are silent on such mundane details, focused instead on grander topics like kings and battles and the affairs of the church. But walking back up the hill with your fresh-cut hazel stem over your shoulder, you know the answer without needing documents. Of course they understood. You couldn't survive in this landscape without understanding. You couldn't choose wood that would last, that would carve well, that would bear the weight of years and weather and constant use. The knowledge was passed down, generation to generation, father to son, not in books but in the simple act of walking into a thicket and knowing which stem to cut. Back in the bothy, you prop the new stem in a corner where it can season slowly, away from the fire's direct heat. It will be months before you can work it properly, months of watching it dry, months of turning it occasionally to prevent warping, months of anticipation as you imagine the patterns you'll carve into its surface. Your current staff stands in the opposite corner, its carvings catching the firelight, and you feel a strange twinge of something that might be jealousy. The new staff is pure potential, unmarked, unwritten. The old staff is full, complete, its story nearly told. You love them both, but differently, the old one for what it's become, the new one for what it might be. That night, you dream of forests. Not the scattered thickets and woodlands you know from this landscape, but vast, ancient forests where trees have stood for centuries, their trunks wider than your bothy, their canopies blocking out the sky. In the dream, you walk among them, touching their bark, listening to sounds you can't quite hear. They're speaking to you, you realize, not in words, but in the language of growth rings and grain patterns, the language of wood itself. You wake with the feeling that you've learned something important, something you can't quite remember, and you reach for your staff as if it might help you hold on to the knowledge. The old man appears at your bothy one evening, emerging from the mist like something from a dream. You haven't seen another human in weeks, and your first instinct is fear. Strangers in these hills are rarely good news, could be thieves or raiders or just men driven mad by their own solitude. But something about his walk, his posture, the way he carries his staff tells you he's not a threat. He's a shepherd, like you, and he's old enough that he's probably been doing this longer than you've been alive. You invite him in, because that's what you do up here. Hospitality isn't a choice, it's survival. He settles by your fire, accepts the food you offer, and for a long time neither of you speaks. The silence is comfortable, the silence of men who've spent so long alone that words feel optional. You study him while he eats, the deep lines on his face, the way his hands curve around his bowl, the staff propped beside him that's so covered in carvings you can barely see the wood beneath. After he's eaten, he reaches for his staff and holds it out to you. An invitation. You take it carefully, reverently, and you begin to read. The staff is a lifetime. You see carvings so old they've almost worn away. Patterns that must have been made when he was young, when his hands were steady and his eyes were sharp. You see layers upon layers, new carvings overlapping old ones, stories written over stories until some parts are almost illegible. There's a spiral that winds from base to top, but it's interrupted in places by other patterns, other marks, other memories. There are sheep everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one representing an animal he's known and lost. There are symbols you don't recognize, patterns you've never seen, a whole vocabulary of marks that must mean something to him even if they're meaningless to you. He watches you study his staff, and when you look up, he nods. You want to learn, he says. It's not a question. You nod. Good. Most young shepherds think they know everything already. They carve what they feel like carving, add whatever comes to mind, and their staffs end up looking like a child scribbles. He reaches for his staff, takes it back from you, runs his thumb along a section near the top. This took me 40 years. 40 years of learning, of making mistakes, of carving over mistakes, of figuring out what works and what doesn't. You want to learn? Then watch. He takes out his knife, an old blade, worn thin from years of sharpening, but still keen, and he begins to carve. Not on his own staff, which has no room left, but on a piece of scrap wood he pulls from his pouch. You watch his hands, the way they move, the way the knife finds the wood at exactly the right angle, the way the shavings curl away in long, even strips. He's not carving anything specific, just demonstrating technique, showing you how to let the blade flow rather than forcing it. The wood knows what it wants to become, he says. Your job is to help it get there, not to fight it. Hours pass. The fire burns down and you add more fuel. The old man talks as he carves, sharing stories you'll remember for the rest of your life. He tells you about the winter of 1315, when the snow piled so deep that sheep and shepherds died by the dozens, and he survived by eating bark and burning his own spare staffs for warmth. He tells you about the year the wolves came back, driven down from the north by some disaster no one ever understood, and how the shepherd had to band together to protect their flocks, sleeping in shifts with fire blazing all night. He tells you about the girl he might have married, the one who waited 3 years and then gave up, married a farmer instead, and he tells it without bitterness, just as a fact, just as the way things were. Historians still argue whether the craft of staff carving was passed down through formal apprenticeship or simply absorbed through years of observation. The medieval records don't mention it, focused as they are on more important matters like wool prices and land disputes. But sitting here with this old man, watching his knife move through wood, listening to his stories of winters and wolves and lost loves, you understand that the question misses the point. The craft is passed down however it can be passed down, through words, through demonstration, through the simple act of one human sharing what they know with another. It doesn't need to be formal. It just needs to happen. By morning, the old man is gone. You wake to find the fire banked and his spot empty, the only evidence of his visit a piece of scrap wood left by the hearth, carved with a pattern you've never seen. You pick it up, study it, try to understand what he was teaching you. The pattern is simple but somehow perfect, a spiral that flows into a series of interlocking curves, then resolves back into spiral. It's like a conversation, a back and forth between different ways of moving through wood. You prop it where you can see it, and you know you'll study it for weeks, months, maybe years, trying to understand everything it contains. Your own staff stands in the corner, waiting. You pick it up, run your thumb over its carvings, and for the first time you see it differently, not as a finished object, but as a work in progress, a conversation you're having with yourself across time. The old man's staff held 40 years of learning. Yours holds maybe 5. But you have time, if you're lucky, if the winters don't take you, if the wolves stay away. You have time to learn, to make mistakes, to carve over mistakes, to figure out what works and what doesn't. You have time to become the old man who shows up at some young shepherd's bothy 50 years from now, carrying a staff so full there's no room left, ready to pass on what you've learned. The day comes when you have to leave the hills for good. It's not a choice you make willingly. The hills have become part of you, as necessary as breathing, and the thought of living anywhere else feels like a kind of death. But your body has made the decision for you. Your knees won't carry you up the steep slopes anymore. Your hands shake too much to hold a knife steady, and the winters that once felt bracing now cut through you like blades. You're old now, older than you ever expected to be, and it's time to go down. The walk takes longer than it used to. You stop often to rest, leaning on your staff, not the new one you cut years ago, which has its own carvings now, its own stories, but the old one, the one you've carried for decades, the one so covered in patterns that you can barely find the wood beneath. The sheep follow you, because they always have, but at the edge of the hills you'll hand them over to a younger shepherd, a boy you've been training for years, who will carry on the work you can no longer do. He's waiting there, at the boundary where the hills give way to farmland, And when you see him you feel something crack inside you. Something you didn't know was still whole. You hand over the flock, one by one, telling him their names, their histories, their quirks and habits. He listens carefully, nods, asks questions. He's good, this boy, better than you were at his age, more patient, more attentive. The flock will be fine in his hands. You hand over the bothy keys too, though there are no locks up here, no keys either. It's just a gesture, a symbol, a way of saying this is yours now, take care of it. He takes them solemnly, and you see in his eyes that he understands what you're giving him. Then you turn and walk down toward the village, and you don't look back. You can't. If you look back, you might not be able to keep walking. Your family's cottage is still there, though your mother is gone now, and most of your siblings have moved away or died. A niece you barely know takes you in, gives you a corner by the fire, feeds you and asks nothing in return. You're grateful, though the gratitude feels strange. You've spent so long alone, so long depending on no one but yourself, that accepting help feels like admitting defeat. But you accept it anyway. Because what choice do you have? The first few weeks are the hardest. The cottage feels cramped after the vast openness of the hills, the noise of village life overwhelming after decades of near silence. You find yourself reaching for your staff constantly, not to walk with. You barely leave the cottage, but just to hold, to touch, to remind yourself of who you are. The carvings catch the firelight, and you trace them one by one, revisiting each memory they hold. The spiral from your first year, when you were young and terrified and had no idea what you were doing. The you who died, still there after all these years, her shape worn slightly smoother by your constant touching. The cross and the hand, still reaching toward each other. The patterns you learned from the old man who visited your bothy so many years ago, the ones you've added to and modified and made your own. Your niece notices the staff. Of course, everyone notices it. She asks about the carvings, and you try to explain, but the words still won't come. So you hand her the staff, let her see for herself, let her fingers trace the patterns you've spent a lifetime creating. She's quiet for a long time, studying it, and when she looks up, her eyes are wet. "These are all your sheep," she says. It's not a question. You nod. "And this," she touches the spiral, "is the path you walked every day." Another nod. "And this, the cross, is for Grandma. For when she died and you couldn't come down." You hadn't realized that was there. You'd carved it without thinking, during that long winter when news finally reached you that your mother had passed, and you'd had no one to tell, no one to share the grief with. But yes, that's what it is. That's what it's always been. Historians still argue whether these carved staffs were primarily functional objects or something closer to autobiography. Whether the shepherds who made them thought of themselves as recording their lives for posterity. The evidence is scattered and ambiguous, as evidence always is when the people in question couldn't write and didn't leave written records. But sitting here in this cottage, watching your niece trace the patterns of your life with her young fingers, you understand that the question doesn't need an answer. The staff is what it is. It holds your life, your memories, your losses and loves and long lonely hours. Whether anyone else can read it doesn't matter. You can read it. And now, maybe, she can too. That night, you dream of the hills. You're young again, walking the high pastures with your flock spread out before you, the wind in your face and the sun on your back. Your staff is in your hand, smooth and familiar, and you're carving as you walk, adding another sheep, another memory, another piece of yourself to the wood. The dream feels so real that when you wake, you're disoriented, confused by the cottage walls and the fire and the sound of your niece moving in the other room. But your staff is there, propped beside your bed, and when you reach for it, you feel yourself settle. The hills are still there, even if you're not. And you're still there, in the wood, in the carvings, in the life you spent decades creating. Winter settles over the village like a blanket, thick and white and endless. You spend most of your days by the fire, wrapped in blankets your niece insists on loaning you, watching the flames dance and shift. The world outside has shrunk to a small circle of white: the cottage, the path to the well, the occasional neighbor struggling through drifts to check on you. But inside, by the fire, the world is larger. Inside, you have your staffs. They're all around you now, propped in corners, leaning against walls, arranged by the hearth like old friends gathered for conversation. The first staff you ever carved, crude and simple. The patterns barely recognizable as patterns. The staff from your middle years, when your skill had grown and your confidence had blossomed, covered in intricate designs that still make you proud. The final staff, the one you were working on when your hands finally gave out, only half carved, its patterns frozen mid-creation. And everywhere, scattered among them, the staffs you never finished, the staffs you started and abandoned, the staffs you kept because you couldn't bear to part with them. Your niece brings you wood. She doesn't understand why you need it. You can barely hold a knife anymore, and even if you could, your hands shake too much to carve anything recognizable. But she brings it anyway, small pieces of hazel and ashen oak, and she sets them by your chair where you can reach them. You pick them up sometimes, hold them, feel their weight and grain. You run your thumb along their surfaces, imagining the patterns you might have carved if things were different. And sometimes, when your hands are steady enough and the fire is bright enough, you try. The knife feels strange now, foreign in your grip. Your fingers don't close around it the way they used to, don't find the right angles without conscious thought. Every cut is a struggle, a negotiation between what you want to do and what your body will allow. The shavings are ragged, uneven, nothing like the clean curls you used to produce without thinking. But you keep trying, because trying is what you do, what you've always done. The wood doesn't care if your cuts are perfect. The wood just wants to be carved. You're working on a small piece of hazel, nothing special, just something to keep your hands busy, when your great-nephew wanders over. He's maybe 6 years old, curious about everything, fascinated by the old man in the corner who never stops fiddling with sticks. He watches you for a while, his young eyes following your knife's uncertain path, and then he asks the question you've been waiting for. What are you making? You look at the wood in your hands, at the rough cuts and uneven lines, and you realize you don't know. You're not making anything, really, just cutting, just moving the knife, just filling time. But that's not an answer you can give a 6-year-old. A story, you say. I'm making a story. He considers this, his small face serious. Can I see? You hold out the wood, let him take it. He studies it carefully, turning it over in his hands, running his fingers over the cuts you've made. His brow furrows with concentration, and you remember being that age. Remember the first time your father put a piece of wood in your hands and showed you how to hold a knife. I don't see a story, he says finally. Not yet. Stories take time. You have to add them bit by bit, day by day. By the time you're done, there's a whole world in there that wasn't there before. He hands the wood back to you, and you see something in his eyes. A spark, a curiosity, a desire to understand. You reach for another piece of wood, a smaller one, and you hold it out to him. Hey! You try. He takes it eagerly, and you show him how to hold the knife, your hands guiding his, steady for this moment, strong enough for this one task. He makes his first cut, a small, tentative shaving curling away from the wood, and his face lights up with wonder. You've seen that look before, on your own face decades ago, on the faces of young shepherds you've taught over the years. It's the look of someone discovering that they can create, that they can leave a mark, that they can make something that wasn't there before. Historians still argue whether the craft of staff carving survived the Middle Ages, whether it persisted into later centuries or died out as shepherding changed and modernized. The evidence is mixed. Carved staffs appear in paintings and documents for centuries after the medieval period, but whether they represent a continuous tradition or a series of rediscoveries is impossible to say. But sitting here by this fire, watching your great-nephew make his first tentative cuts, you understand that the question misses the point. The craft survives wherever someone picks up a knife and a piece of wood and decides to make something. It survives in moments like this, in the passing of knowledge from one pair of hands to another, in the simple act of teaching a child that they can create. The winter continues outside, snow piling against the door, wind rattling the shutters. But inside, by the fire, it's warm. Inside, by the fire, a 6-year-old is learning to carve, and an old man is remembering what it felt like to be young, and the staffs propped in every corner hold the accumulated stories of a lifetime, waiting for someone to read them. Centuries pass. The bothy on the hill crumbles, its stones scattered by sheep and weather, its turf roof long since returned to earth. The paths you walked are overgrown, then paved, then overgrown again as the hills shift and change and the sheep find new routes to follow. The village where you spent your final years grows and shrinks and grows again, its cottages replaced by houses, its houses replaced by ruins, its ruins replaced by fields. Everything changes. Everything passes. Everything except the staffs. They survive in strange ways, in unexpected places. One turns up in a museum, donated by a family who found it in their attic and had no idea what it was. Another surfaces at an auction, bought by a collector who specializes in folk art and recognizes its value. A third sits in a private home, propped in a corner just as you propped it centuries ago, its carvings worn smooth by generations of curious fingers. And a fourth, your final staff, the one you were working on when your hands gave out, lies in a display case, under glass, with a small card that reads, Medieval Shepherd's Crook, Origin Unknown, circa 14th century. The museum is quiet, climate-controlled, full of hushed voices and shuffling feet. School children pass by the display case, their eyes glazing over at yet another old thing behind yet another piece of glass. But one child stops. She's maybe 10 years old, bored by the tour, trailing behind her class. Something about this staff catches her attention, the way the light hits it, maybe, or the patterns carved into its surface. She presses her face to the glass, studying it. Her teacher calls her name. She doesn't move. The patterns are faint now, worn by centuries of handling before the staff found its way to this case. But they're still there, if you know how to look. A spiral, winding from base to near the top. A U, her shape softened but still recognizable. A cross and a hand, reaching toward each other across the wood. Other patterns too, patterns the girl can't read, patterns whose meanings have been lost, patterns that were personal to you and will never be fully understood by anyone else. But she doesn't need to read them. Not really. She just needs to see them, to feel their weight, to understand that someone made this, someone held it, someone carved their life into its surface. The teacher calls again, more urgently, and the girl tears herself away from the glass and runs to catch up. But she'll remember this moment. Years from now, when she's older, she'll think about the staff and wonder who carved it, and why, and what their life was like. She'll never know the answers, but she'll keep wondering. And in wondering, she'll keep the staff alive. Historians still argue about the meanings of these carvings, about the lives of the shepherds who made them, about the world that produced such objects. They analyze the patterns, compare them across regions and centuries, debate whether certain symbols had specific meanings or were just decorative. They write papers and books, attend conferences, argue with each other in academic journals. And through it all, the staff sit in their display cases, silent, patient, waiting for someone to read them. But you know the truth, because you lived it. The carvings don't have single meanings, fixed interpretations, dictionary definitions. They have the meanings you gave them, the meanings that accumulated over decades of solitude and carving and remembering. The you is that you, the one who died in the hollow, but she's also every you ever loved and lost. The spiral is the path to the high pastures, but it's also the path of your life, the endless seasons and years and the slow accumulation of memory. The cross and the hand are your prayers, your reaching, your attempts to connect with something beyond yourself. And the other patterns, the ones no one can read anymore, they're the parts of you that were always private, always personal, never meant to be fully understood by anyone else. The girl who stopped at the display case will grow up, will have her own life, her own solitude and creation and carving in whatever form that takes. She won't become a shepherd, that world is long gone, replaced by different ways of living, different kinds of isolation. But she'll remember the staff. And maybe, years from now, when she's old and sitting by her own fire, she'll pick up a piece of wood and a knife and begin to carve. She won't know why. She won't understand that she's continuing something ancient, something that stretches back through centuries of lonely humans making their mark on the world. She'll just feel the need, the urge, the quiet compulsion to create. And that's enough. That's always been enough. The staff survive because the need to carve survives, because humans have always needed to leave their mark, to say I was here, I existed, I spent my days doing more than just surviving. The shepherds are gone, the bothies are gone, the world they knew is gone. But the staffs remain, and the impulse that created them remains, and somewhere, right now, someone is picking up a knife and a piece of wood and beginning to carve. Now, as the fire burns low and the night deepens around you, let the weight of all those centuries settle gently. The hills are quiet, the sheep are sleeping, and the staff in your hands holds everything you've ever been. Tomorrow you'll add another line, another memory, another piece of yourself to the wood. But tonight, you rest. Tonight, you let the carvings speak for themselves, telling their silent stories to anyone who stops long enough to listen. The world will forget you, eventually, but the wood will remember. The wood always remembers.